I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
Countless blockbuster movies have depicted a world where humanity is on the brink of destruction. But in the real world, what would it take to be an existential threat? Could a terrorist attack wipe us out? What can we do to prepare for the worst and ensure our survival? That's what we'll discuss with our guests. Welcome, Zak and Gary. Please introduce yourselves.
I'm Zak Kallenborn. I have an excessive number of titles at this point. I'm a lead researcher at Looking Glass USA, a counter-UAS consultancy. I'm also affiliated with Center for Strategic International Studies, George Mason University, START at the University of Maryland, the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, and I think that's all of them at the moment.
My name is Gary Ackerman. I'm a professor and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity at the University at Albany. I'm also the founder of the Center for Advanced Red Teaming, an advisor to the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, and the CEO of an LLC focused on adversary behavior called Nemesis Insights. And I also have many other titles, but those are probably the most relevant. So I've been working for many years on the intersection between emerging technologies and adversaries. So rather than just looking at them separately, there's a whole lot of bad folks in the world doing bad things, and there's a whole lot of technologies which are dangerous. I try and look at how they interact with each other. And that brings together both the traditional scientific and technical side of things. And I do most of my work on chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. But it also brings in the psychological, sociological aspect of things. So I like to say that I operate at the socio-technical nexus. And at the same time, I also do look at a lot of forecasting and look at a lot of what are the emerging threats, emerging risks that we need to worry about, and how do we analyze those. So I do things like red teaming and horizon scanning and all kinds of other work to try and get ahead of problems before they surprise us. So trying to discover the black swans before they hit us in the head, to mangle a few metaphors.
Thank you. Zak, what about you?
Yeah, my work is very similar, looking at sort of that. I liked Gary's phrasing, the nexus of, socio and technological threats there, looking out to the future to understand like what could be coming down the horizon, and particularly how sort of technologies interact with social environments, and particularly threat environments, looking at, terrorist actors, adversarial states, as well as just, actors writ large. Topically, though, I'm much more focused on autonomous weapons, drone warfare, drone swarms, sort of extreme forms of terrorism, and kind of like drone. And I'm also interested in global catastrophic risks writ large, just ways that humanity might manage to destroy itself, which in many ways is frequently a combination interaction between social forces and technological ones, because, no matter how powerful any of us are, there isn't really much we can do without sort of extreme technology, at least in terms of generating or preventing many of these extreme catastrophes, from super volcanoes to asteroids to biowarfare to nukes. There's a complex interplay constantly between technology and societies that generates many of these risks.
Existential terrorism. Can terrorists destroy humanity? Can you tell me more about that?
We're particularly interested in sort of what are some of these sort of grand future threats here. For years, states and international organizations and a wide variety of organizations have been concerned with weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, your chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear. But what got us kind of inspired this paper is we were thinking about that in many cases, as catastrophic and horrible as a lot of weapons of mass destruction terrorism would be, it is not existential in the sense of posing a real risk to the survival of humanity as a species, or even just, the survival of the human civilization as a whole, even if you don't actually literally wipe out every single human being. Like if we imagine, say, a nuclear weapon goes off in New York City, that is an incredibly horrible tragedy without question. Potentially hundreds of thousands, potentially even millions of people would die. But at the same time, I think we can reasonably say that that would not itself sort of destroy the humanity as a whole, even if it would be incredibly, incredibly horrible. So we looked at like, okay, what if we go that step further? What would it look like for terrorists to actually destroy human civilization? Thankfully, our bottom line is that we think it's extremely unlikely. The scary part, though, is we do conclude that there are at least some plausible pathways for that to happen. And so we look at analyze both the motivations and those particular pathways. So we look at motivations in terms of radical environmentalism. There's a lot of folks who believe that the environment should be prioritized, and that human civilization is antithetical to the thrival of bio life and environmental life, and so we need to sort of scale back to more hunter-gatherer times in order to let the environment thrive. There's also various sort of cathartic utilitarian, or sorry, not utilitarian, more like sort of apocalyptic type beliefs of the world is going to end, and that's a good thing to kick off some sort of religious event or ideological type event. Then we also have sort of negative utilitarianism, basically that life is suffering, and folks might conclude that, well, okay, if life is suffering, then the way to resolve that suffering is to wipe out life. In a very sort of very crude logic there.
Although that is something that has been put forward by certain philosophers. Sorry to interrupt, Zach. I actually just wanted to say that when we initially started looking at this, we sort of took that step back and said to us, we were very skeptical. We said, like, is this just crazy? Most of our colleagues would think we're crazy to think that terrorists could destroy humanity or civilization. Terrorism is a bounded problem. It's bad. It's there. It causes a lot of suffering, but it's a very kind of a limited problem in a sense. And initially we were skeptical about, should we even write anything, or should we even consider and think through this? And I think there were two reasons why we thought it would be a good idea. First of all, it does, even if we found out the answer is no, terrorists could never do this, it allows us to think about kind of the upper bounds. So the upper bounds of what small groups of people can do, or conversely, the lower bounds of what's required to wipe out humanity in terms of human action. So it does sort of, at the very least, it sort of helps set some perimeters. But even then, we also said to ourselves, it's worth thinking through some of these problems, because if you don't think through some of these problems, you might miss something that otherwise, that if we focus on what we regard as the middle of the distribution, the median problems and problems that everybody's looking at, we keep getting surprised. So maybe you need to expand your thinking and broaden your thinking a little bit. So we viewed this very much as a speculative exercise. When we went in, we did not necessarily expect to have any positive conclusions that terrorists could, in fact, wipe out humanity or pose existential risk. We found actually, when we started thinking about it, that there were sort of things that, as far as we know, nobody has really analyzed before. So I just want to say that we were very skeptical, but as we started going into this, we found that there was definitely a there. Now, we're not saying that this is going to happen tomorrow, or that it's even a moderate likelihood, but it's also not something that is completely unfeasible or implausible. So I just want to sort of jump in there. I also like the fact about the whole idea of environmentalists. It's radical environmentalists who think you have to kind of in order to save the biosphere and non-human life, you actually have to end human life. And people often have a difficulty relating that, and I call it kind of, if you've seen the Avengers, Infinity War, that's the Thanos argument, except he only wanted to end half of all life. There are people there who would think that all human life disappearing would actually be a net positive for the universe.
You mentioned the existential attack versus the existential spoiler versus the systemic harm, and the three different ways that there could arise this destruction of humanity, right? Could you talk a little bit about those?
The direct attack is where a terrorist or a small group or even an individual actively acts to try and destroy humanity, and through their actions causes the harm, through their direct actions. So just like a terrorist puts a bomb in a city square, the terrorist would have to unleash a dangerous pathogen, or that wipes out humanity, or employ some kind of new technology to wipe out humanity. So that's direct attack. And even if we say that terrorists might one day get nuclear weapons, they're not going to get enough to wipe out humanity on their own. They'd have to get thousands of nuclear weapons. So that then moves to the next side, which is indirect attack. Indirect attack is terrorists or other violent non-state actors, or even an individual, using somebody else's resources, skills, infrastructure to launch their attack. So it's an indirect attack.
Yeah. So, the idea of spoilers here is that, states in the global community for, I suppose, decades to, well, I guess arguably a century or more, have recognized, that there are these sort of existential risks that are out there independent of terrorism, things like supervolcanoes, asteroids, bioweapons, nukes, et cetera, and have taken actions of a variety of sort to try and reduce and mitigate those measures. So the idea with a spoiler is basically where a terrorist, rather than sort of generating, the pandemic or whatever, it takes actions to reduce or remove those mitigation measures in a way that drastically increases the potential for existential harm.
For your research, what would you like to see happening from your research? What actions?
So, I think there's a couple easy things that we can do. You can think about like building resilience and protection into, many of these like existential risk mitigation measures. Like if we talk about launching planetary defense missions, like, okay, do we have appropriate terrorism security? That one's probably an easy one. Hopefully they have some measure of counterterrorism insider threat programs for these. But you might consider increasing them, making sure that planetary defense missions are treated akin to like, a nuclear weapons program, where this is like, it's very, very, very highly secure and you treat it with appropriate level of security. Likewise, I think you can build redundancy into some of these potentially significant measures. Like, it shouldn't just be a single mission, planetary defense mission. Aiming to do this, there should be multiple redundant capabilities, other people, other organizations able to do things. I think the other easy one is, intelligence and information sharing. Folks should, or more precisely, like intelligence communities around the world should try to share information about potential apocalyptic threats as well as groups. We don't think, because we think overall is a relatively low priority, we don't think this needs to be, number one. Everyone needs to be focusing on that. But I think that is an area for international cooperation and sharing, because if we're talking about threat to humanity, then everyone should be concerned about that, so everyone from China, Russia, the United States. So building cooperation around that, I think, is definitely an easy answer.
Specifically, the emerging technologies related to, let's say, CRISPR or DNA sequencing. In your article, you were talking a little bit about how there are organizations making it more open for many people to be able to do that. Is that a risk area that you would say is developing?
Because of the pace of technological change, especially in the biosciences, things that before, used to take decades to move from the cutting edge labs to a normal university lab, and several decades more to move to kind of a high school level and a general public use or access to something. Now all of that is happening in just a couple of years. So you're going from, new discoveries like CRISPR being made and winning Nobel Prizes for that. And within 10 years, high school students are using CRISPR to insert jellyfish genes into plants so they glow in the dark. And this is actually, so it's that, and the things that are happening today, the new CRISPRs of today, are going to be they're going to reach widespread use even more rapidly than CRISPR did. So it's not that, any particular, biological or biotechnological, improvement is going to have a particular pose a particular danger, but it's just that there's so much happening so quickly, and we have tools that can accelerate that. So we have a new AI revolution now, where beforehand it used to take them months, if not years, to analyze just a few protein structures for relevance. Now you can have systems that analyze 1 million of them in a day. Using AI and that. So, that is going it's much more about the democratizing of the technology than I think it is the technology itself. So that's what we're kind of worried, because I'm not so worried. Before, we always used to say, be a lot more worried about a scientist becoming a terrorist than a terrorist becoming a scientist. And to some extent, that's still true, but it's becoming less and less true. In 10 years' time, I think you might have exceptional scientific capabilities in the hands of anybody who's kind of graduated high school, which is, has its own dangers that we need to think about.
Of course, it's not just, I think that illustrates sort of a larger point about sort of the proliferation and availability of these technologies, because, it's not just CRISPR that has these same dynamics. We see that within drone contexts as well, where, you can get online. There's all sorts of hobbyist groups where you can sort of learn these technologies, figure out how they work. You can, go and take various classes and, and go get a lot of this technology. And again, although I don't think drones particularly carry an existential threat, that might very well be true. And you might see those same types of behaviors with some of these future technologies that we're talking about that might also pose major threats. The one that immediately comes to mind is artificial intelligence, where, now there's so much incredible interest all over the place with artificial intelligence, folks running off and getting degrees. There's, courses online. There's all sorts of things here. How easy it is in the future to sort of make some of these systems is certainly an unknown, especially if we talk about artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence, where, we haven't made it yet. So at the moment, we don't really need to worry about a terrorist making anything like that. But, in the future, what does that actually look like? And, as the technology matures, as it becomes more available, what's the floor and the minimum level of capability? So on the one hand, I think about like CRISPR, yeah, we do have folks that, can do those types of things with a very, very minimal capability. But then I also think about, nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons, where like even now, like you need a tremendous amount of resources. Like no one's making a gigantic uranium enrichment, plant in their garage. Like that's just not happening. There's a very, very high floor there, thankfully. But if it comes to sort of AI, nanotechnologies, some of these other things, geoengineering, we don't really know where that floor is. If it's very high, maybe it's not as big of a deal. But if it comes down, if people are able to create some of these like artificial general intelligence, maybe not in their garage, but with a minimum amount of like data storage, data capability, that potentially changes some of these risks potentially quite drastically.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.